In a vast wilderness of ancient Africa, when the world was younger and wilder than anything we can imagine today, there lived creatures of magnificent power and beauty. Among the rolling savannas and dense forests, where the earth itself seemed to pulse with raw energy, an extraordinary bond was about to form between the most unlikely of companions. This is not just a story of survival, but a tale of how one moment of pure courage can echo through time itself, creating legends that outlive civilizations. What you are about to discover is the true account of Amara, a young girl whose heart held more bravery than armies, and Aslan, a lion whose destiny was written in the stars. Their story begins in a time when humans and animals spoke the same language of survival, when the line between myth and reality was as thin as morning mist, and when a single act of kindness could reshape the very fabric of legend itself. Prepare yourself for a journey back to when the world was painted in broader strokes, when every sunrise brought new dangers and new possibilities, and when a girl's unwavering spirit would save not just a life, but birth a legend that would inspire millions for generations to come. The morning sun painted the African plains in shades of gold and amber as Amara stepped outside her family shelter. She was 12 years old, with eyes that held the wisdom of someone much older and a spirit that seemed to dance with the wind itself. The year was beyond counting, in a time when the earth was still learning its own rhythms, and humans lived as part of the great tapestry of nature rather than apart from it. Amara belonged to the Kasai tribe, a people known for their deep connection to the animal kingdom. Unlike other tribes who saw animals merely as sources of food or threats to avoid, the Kasai believed that every creature carried a piece of the world's soul within them. They lived by the ancient code that understanding and respect could bridge any gap between species, no matter how vast or dangerous it might seem. The girl had always been different from others in her tribe. While children her age played games and learned traditional crafts, Amara spent her days wandering the edges of their settlement, observing the behavior of birds, listening to the calls of distant elephants, and studying the patterns that hyenas made when they moved across the plains. Her grandmother, Kasazana, often said that Amara had been born with the gift of the old ways, the ability to read the language that all living things spoke before humans forgot how to listen. On this particular morning, as the dew still clung to the tall grass, and the air carried the fresh scent of wild jasmine, Amara felt a strange pull toward the eastern hills. Something was calling to her, though she couldn't quite understand what it was. The feeling started as a gentle tugging in her chest, like a thread being slowly pulled. But as she walked through her daily tasks of helping her mother prepare breakfast and feeding their small flock of goats, the sensation grew stronger and more urgent. Her father, Django, was the tribe's head scout, responsible for tracking the movements of both prey and predators in their territory. He had taught Amara to read tracks from the time she could walk, showing her how the depth and spacing of footprints could tell stories about an animal's health, its intentions, and even its emotions. She had learned to distinguish between the padded steps of a leopard hunting and one that was simply traveling, between the heavy trudging of a rhino in distress and one moving contentedly toward water. That morning, as Django prepared to lead a hunting party toward the river where zebras had been spotted drinking, Amara approached him with unusual determination. She told him about the feeling that had been growing inside her, the certainty that something important was happening in the eastern hills, something that needed her attention. Any other father might have dismissed such talk as childish imagination, but Django had seen too much in his years as a scout to ignore the instincts that seemed to run in his daughter's blood. After a long moment of studying her face, reading the seriousness in her young features, Django made a decision that would change everything. He told the hunting party to proceed without him and announced that he would accompany Amara to investigate whatever was drawing her toward the hills. Her mother, Safia, initially protested, worried about the dangers that might await them in unfamiliar territory. But she too had learned to trust the unusual gifts that seemed to flow through her daughter like water through a riverbed. As they prepared for their journey, Nkosazana pulled Amara aside. The old woman's weathered hands held a small leather pouch containing herbs and stones that had been passed down through generations of their family's women. She pressed it into Amara's palm and spoke in the ancient tongue that only the eldest members of their tribe still remembered. The words translated roughly to "courage finds its own path," but Amara understood that the meaning went much deeper than simple translation could capture. The walk toward the eastern hills took them through terrain that gradually shifted from the familiar grasslands of their home territory into rockier, more challenging landscape. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner and carried different scents, wild and untamed fragrances that spoke of places where few human feet had ever walked. Amara's father moved with the silent grace of someone who had spent his entire life reading the land. But even he seemed cautious as they entered this new territory. By midday, they had reached the lower slopes of the hills, where ancient baobab trees cast their massive shadows across the ground, and the sound of their footsteps seemed to echo with unusual clarity. It was here that Amara suddenly stopped, her hand raised in a gesture that told her father to halt. She stood perfectly still, her head tilted slightly to one side, listening to something that only she seemed able to hear. The sound came again, carried on the wind from somewhere higher up the hillside. It was faint but unmistakable, a low rumbling that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself. But this wasn't the confident roar of a healthy lion announcing its presence to the world. This was something else entirely, a sound filled with pain and desperation that made Amara's heart race with both fear and compassion. Her father heard it too, and his expression grew serious. He knew that sound as well as any scout in their tribe. It was the call of a lion in severe distress, possibly injured or trapped. Such situations were incredibly dangerous, as wounded animals were unpredictable and often more aggressive than usual. Every instinct told him that they should turn back, report what they had heard to the tribal council, and let the experienced hunters decide how to handle the situation. But as Django turned to suggest their retreat, he saw something in his daughter's face that stopped him cold. Amara's eyes held a determination that seemed to burn from within, and her entire posture spoke of someone who had found their purpose. She looked at him and spoke with a voice that carried authority far beyond her 12 years, telling him that whatever was suffering up in those hills needed their help, and that they were the only ones who could provide it. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when they finally located the source of the distress calls. Hidden in a narrow ravine between two rocky outcroppings, they discovered a sight that would remain burned in their memories forever. A magnificent male lion, his golden mane full and proud despite his current predicament, lay trapped beneath a massive boulder that had apparently fallen from the cliff face above. The lion's hind legs were pinned beneath the stone, and though he was clearly in tremendous pain, his amber eyes still burned with the fierce intelligence that marked him as something special among his kind. Around the trapped animal, the ground showed signs of his struggle to free himself. Deep gouges in the earth marked where his powerful claws had scraped desperately for purchase, and the rock itself bore the marks of his attempts to push or dig his way out of the trap. What struck both Amara and her father immediately was the lion's size and bearing. Even trapped and suffering, he radiated a presence that went beyond mere physical power. There was something almost regal about him, as if he carried within himself the essence of every great lion that had ever ruled the African plains. His coat, though dusty from his struggles, seemed to shimmer with an inner light, and his mane was fuller and more magnificent than any either of them had ever seen. Django's first instinct was to retreat immediately. A trapped lion was one of the most dangerous situations any human could encounter. The animal would be in pain, frightened, and likely to attack anyone who came near, regardless of their intentions. Even if they wanted to help, which seemed impossible given their limited tools and resources, approaching the creature would almost certainly result in death for both of them. But Amara seemed drawn to the suffering animal by a force stronger than fear or common sense. She studied the trapped lion with the same intense focus she brought to all her observations of animal behavior, and gradually a plan began to form in her mind. The boulder that held him was large, but not impossibly so. With the right leverage and approach, it might be possible to shift it enough for the lion to pull himself free. More importantly, she sensed something in the great cat's demeanor that gave her hope. Despite his pain and predicament, there was a calmness about him that suggested intelligence, and perhaps even an understanding that help might be at hand. When their eyes met across the ravine, instead of the snarl of aggression she might have expected, she saw what looked almost like recognition, as if some part of him understood that she meant no harm. As the shadows grew longer and the day began to fade, Amara knew that time was running short. The longer the lion remained trapped, the weaker he would become, and the less likely it would be that any rescue attempt could succeed. Moreover, the approaching night would bring other predators to investigate the distress calls, creating additional dangers for everyone involved. She turned to her father and began to explain her plan, speaking with a conviction that surprised them both. Her words came from some deep well of certainty within her, as if she had always known that this moment would come and had been preparing for it throughout her entire life. The plan was dangerous, requiring them to approach close enough to the trapped lion to work with the boulder while somehow avoiding his powerful jaws and claws. But more than the physical danger, Amara's proposal required something that went against every survival instinct her father had ever developed. It required them to trust that this magnificent, deadly predator would somehow understand their intentions and resist his natural impulse to attack anything that came within reach. It meant betting their lives on the hope that courage and compassion could bridge the gap between human and lion, between helper and helped. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky above the eastern hills, Django looked into his daughter's determined eyes and made the second decision that day that would reshape their destiny. Despite every rational objection his mind could produce, despite all his experience and training that screamed warnings, he agreed to help her attempt the impossible rescue of the trapped king of beasts. The stage was set for an encounter that would test not only their courage and skill, but the very boundaries of what was possible when different species recognized their shared need for compassion and understanding. In the growing darkness, with only the light of the rising moon to guide them, a young girl and her father prepared to risk everything for a creature that most humans would see only as a mortal enemy. Neither of them could have imagined that their actions in the hours to come would create ripples that would spread across time itself, giving birth to legends that would inspire countless generations and establishing a bond between human and lion that would become the stuff of myth and wonder for millions of years to come. The moon hung like a silver coin in the star-filled sky as Amara and her father descended into the ravine where the great lion lay trapped. Every step they took seemed to echo with the weight of the impossible task they had chosen to undertake. The night air carried the sense of wild sage and distant rain, mixing with the musky smell of the lion and the metallic tang of blood for where the boulder had scraped against his powerful hindquarters. As they drew closer, the lion's amber eyes tracked their movement with an intelligence that seemed almost human. Django felt his warrior's instincts screaming at him to retreat, every fiber of his being recognizing the mortal danger they were walking into. A lion's claws could tear a man apart in seconds, and its jaws could crush bone with the same ease that a child might snap a dried twig. Even trapped and injured, this magnificent predator remained one of the deadliest creatures on Earth. But Amara seemed to move in a bubble of strange calm, her fear transformed into something else entirely. She approached the trapped animal with the same careful attention she had always shown when observing wildlife. But now there was an added dimension to her focus. She was not just watching the lion. She was communicating with him in ways that went beyond words or gestures, using the ancient language of intention and respect that her grandmother had taught her about in old stories. When they reached the edge of the rocky depression where the lion lay pinned, Amara did something that made her father's heart nearly stop with terror. She knelt down at the very edge of the creature's reach and began to speak to him in low, soothing tones, using the same voice she had always used when calming frightened animals around their settlement. Her words were a mixture of her tribal language and the older tongue that Nkosazana had taught her, sounds that seemed to carry meanings deeper than their surface definitions. The lion's response was nothing short of miraculous. Instead of the snarl of rage or roar of warning that Django expected, the great cat became completely still, his massive head tilting slightly as if he were actually listening to what the young girl was saying. His eyes, which had been wild with pain and frustration, seemed to focus with an intensity that suggested understanding, as if some part of his ancient brain recognized the sincerity in Amara's voice. Slowly, carefully, Amara extended her hand toward the lion, moving with the deliberate grace of someone who understood that sudden movements could shatter the fragile trust she was trying to build. Her father wanted to grab her and pull her back to safety, but something about the scene unfolding before him kept him frozen in place, watching a connection form that defied everything he thought he knew about the relationship between human and predator. Where fingertips made contact with the lion's massive mane, neither of them moved for what felt like an eternity. The touch was gentle, respectful, carrying no threat or demand, simply offering comfort to a creature in pain. The lion's eyes closed briefly, and a sound emerged from his chest that was neither growl nor purr, but something entirely unique, a rumbling acknowledgement of the kindness being offered to him in his moment of greatest need. It was then that Amara began her careful examination of the trapped animal situation, running her hands along the edges of the boulder to understand exactly how it had fallen and where the leverage points might be. The stone was massive, easily weighing as much as several grown men, but she could see that it rested on smaller rocks that might be shifted if approached correctly. More importantly, she realized that the lion was not as severely injured as they had initially feared. The boulder had pinned him, but not crushed him, and if freed quickly enough, he would likely be able to walk away from the ordeal. Her father, still marveling at the impossible scene of his daughter calmly examining a trapped lion as if it were an injured village goat, began to understand the plan that was forming in her mind. Using the long wooden spear he always carried, along with several flat stones they could gather from the ravine floor, they might be able to create a lever system that could shift the boulder just enough to allow the lion to pull himself free. The work would have to be done in almost complete darkness, with only the moonlight to guide them, and it would require them to position themselves dangerously close to the lion's powerful jaws and claws. Most challenging of all, they would need the lion's cooperation. The animal would have to remain calm and trust them completely, even as they worked around his trapped body with tools and rocks that could easily be mistaken for weapons. As if he understood the complexity of what they were proposing, the lion fixed his gaze on Amara with an expression that seemed to communicate his willingness to trust her completely. It was a look that transcended species, carrying the same weight, and meaning that might pass between two humans who had decided to rely on each other in a moment of crisis. In that exchange of glances, a bond was forged that would prove stronger than any chain and more lasting than the mountains themselves. Working together with a coordination that seemed almost supernatural, Amara and Django began to gather the materials they would need for their rescue attempt. They selected rocks of appropriate size and shape to serve as fulcrums, tested the strength of Django's spear to ensure it could withstand the pressure they would need to apply, and carefully planned their approach to minimize the time the lion would have to endure their presence near his most vulnerable areas. Throughout their preparations, Amara maintained her gentle communication with the trapped animal, her voice a constant source of reassurance that seemed to keep him calm despite the pain he was experiencing. She told him stories from her childhood, described the beauty of the plains where she lived, and promised him that soon he would be free to run beneath the stars once again. Whether he understood her words or simply drew comfort from the sound of her voice, the lion remained remarkably peaceful, his breathing steady and his eyes alert but not aggressive. The actual rescue attempt began as the moon reached its highest point in the night sky, casting the ravine in silvery light that made every detail visible, but also created shadows that seemed to move and shift like living things. Django positioned his spear beneath the boulder at the angle Amara had determined would provide the maximum leverage, while she arranged the stones that would serve as their fulcrum point. The first attempt to shift the massive stone was unsuccessful, but rather than becoming discouraged, Amara studied the results and made adjustments to their approach. She moved the fulcrum point slightly, changed the angle of the spear, and asked her father to apply pressure in a different direction. The lion watched their efforts with what seemed like keen interest, occasionally making soft sounds that might have been encouragement or simply acknowledgement of their determination to help him. On the second attempt, they felt the boulder give slightly, shifting just enough to let them know that their plan was sound, even if their execution still needed refinement. The lion seemed to sense the movement as well, his muscles tensing as he prepared to take advantage of any opportunity to free himself. But he waited, demonstrating a patience and understanding that continued to amaze both of his would-be rescuers. It was during their third attempt that everything came together perfectly. Django applied steady pressure to his makeshift lever, while Amara guided the direction of their effort, and slowly, incrementally, the massive boulder began to shift away from the lion's trapped hindquarters. As soon as the pressure lessened enough to give him room to move, the great cat began to carefully extract himself from beneath the stone, moving with deliberate care to avoid any sudden motion that might cause the boulder to settle back into its original position. The moment when the lion finally pulled his rear legs free from beneath the boulder was one that neither Amara nor her father would ever forget. The magnificent creature rose slowly to his feet, testing his weight on legs that had been trapped for hours, and then turned to face the two humans who had risked everything to help him. For a long moment, the three of them stood in the moonlit ravine, predator and prey brought together by circumstances that had transformed them all into something more than their basic natures had previously allowed. What happened next defied every story that Django had ever heard about encounters between humans and lions. Instead of disappearing immediately into the night, as any wild animal might be expected to do after being freed from a trap, the great lion approached Amara with deliberate intent. He moved slowly, giving her every opportunity to retreat if she felt threatened, but his posture communicated gratitude and recognition rather than any hint of aggression. When he reached her, the lion gently pressed his massive head against her chest in a gesture that was unmistakably affectionate. Amara responded by wrapping her arms around his neck, burying her face in his magnificent mane, and for several minutes, girl and lion shared an embrace that seemed to transcend the very boundaries of the natural world. It was a moment of pure connection, two souls recognizing something fundamental and eternal in each other despite the vast differences in their physical forms. Finally, with what seemed like obvious reluctance, the lion stepped back and prepared to depart. But before he left, he did something that would become part of the legend that grew around this night for millions of years to come. He raised his great head toward the star-filled sky and released a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth, a sound that carried notes of triumph, gratitude, and promise all woven together in a voice that spoke of majesty beyond human understanding. As the echoes of that incredible roar faded across the African plains, the lion looked once more into Amara's eyes, and in that final exchange, something passed between them that both would carry for the rest of their lives. Then he turned and disappeared into the darkness, moving with the fluid grace of a creature that was once again master of his own destiny. Standing alone in the moonlit ravine, surrounded by the evidence of what they had accomplished, Amara and her father began the long walk back to their village. Neither spoke much during the journey, both lost in their own thoughts about what they had just experienced. But as they walked beneath the vast African sky, with the lion's magnificent roar still echoing in their memories, they knew that they had been part of something that would live on long after they themselves had returned to the earth that had given them life. 7 days had passed since the rescue in the eastern hills, and life in the Kasai village had settled back into its familiar rhythms. The morning brought the usual sounds of children playing, women grinding grain, and men preparing for the day's hunting and gathering activities. Yet for Amara, nothing felt quite the same as it had before that moonlit night when she and her father had freed the magnificent lion from his rocky prison. She found herself drawn repeatedly to the edges of the settlement, scanning the horizon for any sign of the golden mane that had filled her dreams every night since their return. Her family and the other villagers had listened to their story with a mixture of awe and skepticism, some believing every word while others suggested that the darkness and excitement of the rescue might have made the lion seem larger and more magnificent than he actually was. But Amara knew what she had experienced. The memory of the great cat's amber eyes, filled with intelligence and gratitude, remained as vivid as if she were still kneeling beside him in the ravine. The feeling of his massive head pressed against her chest, the rumble of his acknowledgement, and, most of all, the sense of profound connection that had passed between them, were not the products of imagination or the distortions of memory. They were the foundation of something real and permanent that had changed her forever. On the 8th morning after the rescue, as Amara helped her mother tend their small garden of medicinal plants, a commotion arose from the side of the village that faced the open plains. Children's voices carried on the wind, high and excited, calling for the adults to come and see something extraordinary that was approaching from the grasslands. Amara's heart began to race even before she understood why, some instinctive part of her recognizing that whatever was coming was connected to her recent adventure. When she reached the gathering crowd at the village's edge, she saw him immediately, even though he was still far enough away to appear as little more than a golden speck moving across the vast green sea of grass. But there was no mistaking the way he moved, the fluid power and unmistakable majesty that marked him as the lion she had helped rescue from the boulder's trap. He was walking directly toward their settlement with the confident stride of a king returning to claim his rightful place. The reaction of the villagers was immediate and intense. Most had never seen a lion approach their home so boldly during daylight hours, and many assumed that the animal was either sick or preparing to attack. Women gathered their children and moved toward the safety of their huts, while the men reached for their spears and began forming the defensive circle they had practiced countless times in preparation for just such a situation. But Amara knew, with a certainty that came from some place deeper than logic or fear, that the approaching lion meant no harm to anyone in her village. She could see it in the way he carried himself, the deliberate but non-aggressive pace of his approach, and, most telling of all, the fact that he had chosen to come during the full light of day, when his presence would be clearly visible to all. This was not the behavior of a predator preparing to attack, but rather the actions of someone returning to complete unfinished business. As the lion drew closer, details of his magnificent form became clearer to the assembled villagers, and even those who had been most skeptical of Amara's story began to understand that they were witnessing something far beyond the ordinary. The animal was indeed larger than any lion they had ever seen, his mane fuller and more golden, his bearing more regal. There was something about him that seemed to transform the very air around him, making even the bravest warriors feel they were in the presence of royalty from another realm entirely. When the lion reached the outer boundary of the village, he stopped and sat back on his haunches with the patient dignity of a visiting dignitary waiting to be properly received. His amber gaze swept across the gathered humans until it found and locked onto Amara's face, and in that moment, the connection that had been forged between them in the darkness of the ravine blazed to life once again. She felt her heart leap with joy and recognition, while around her, the other villagers watched in amazement as the great predator seemed to smile in response to seeing her again. Elder Kofi, the oldest and most respected member of their community, stepped forward from the crowd with the slow dignity that befitted his years and status. He had lived through more seasons than anyone could count, and had seen wonders that existed now only in stories passed down through generations. But even he seemed moved by the extraordinary sight of the magnificent lion sitting peacefully at the edge of their village, clearly seeking some form of communication with its human inhabitants. Speaking in the formal tone reserved for important occasions, Elder Kofi addressed the lion as if he were welcoming a visiting chief from another tribe. His words carried respect and acknowledgement of the animal's obvious intelligence and peaceful intentions, while also making it clear that the safety of the village and its people remained his primary concern. It was a delicate diplomatic dance, conducted between two very different species, but governed by the same universal principles of respect and caution. The lion's response to the elder's formal greeting was to rise gracefully to his feet and take several steps closer to the gathering, moving slowly enough to avoid alarming anyone, but with enough confidence to demonstrate that he considered himself welcome among them. When he stopped again, he was close enough for everyone to see the magnificent details of his form, the way the morning sunlight caught and reflected in his golden coat, and, most remarkably, the unmistakable intelligence that blazed in his amber eyes. It was then that the lion did something that would be talked about in the Kasai village for generations to come. He began to move in a pattern around the edge of the gathered humans, never getting close enough to seem threatening, but clearly performing some kind of deliberate display. His movements were graceful and purposeful, like a formal dance that carried meaning beyond mere physical action. As he circled, he periodically paused to look directly at specific individuals, his gaze lingering longest on Amara and her father, acknowledging them as the ones who had shown him kindness in his hour of need. When his ceremonial circuit was complete, the lion returned to his position facing Elder Kofi and executed what could only be described as a bow, lowering his great head in a gesture that was unmistakably respectful and grateful. The symbolism of the moment was lost on no one present. Here was one king acknowledging another, predator and human finding common ground in the ancient languages of honor and recognition. But the lion's visit was far from over. From somewhere deep in his chest came a sound unlike anything the villagers had ever heard before. It was not quite a roar, not quite a purr, but something entirely unique that seemed to carry complex emotional undertones. The sound was warm and resonant, filling the air around them with vibrations that seemed to touch something fundamental in every human heart present. Children stopped crying and looked toward the source with wonder rather than fear, while adults found themselves relaxing despite every instinct that told them to remain alert in the presence of such a powerful predator. Amara understood before anyone else what the lion was trying to communicate. This was not just a visit to acknowledge their kindness. It was an invitation, a request for her to accompany him somewhere for reasons that went beyond simple gratitude. She could feel the pull of whatever he wanted to show her, the same inexorable drawing sensation that had led her to discover him trapped in the ravine. But this time, the feeling was accompanied by excitement rather than concern, a sense of approaching wonder rather than impending crisis. When she stepped forward from the crowd, the lion's entire demeanor changed, becoming more animated and eager. He rose and moved toward her with obvious joy, and when they met, he once again pressed his massive head against her chest in the gesture of affection that was becoming their personal greeting. The villagers watched in amazement as their young girl communed with the great predator as if he were a beloved pet rather than one of the most dangerous animals in all of Africa. Through a combination of intuition and careful observation of his body language, Amara began to understand what the lion wanted her to know. He was trying to tell her about something wonderful that had happened since their rescue encounter, something that he wanted to share with the humans who had shown him such unprecedented kindness. His excitement was infectious, and despite the obvious risks involved in following a wild lion into the unknown, Amara felt her adventurous spirit rising to meet whatever challenge or opportunity he was presenting. The discussion that followed among the village elders was intense and immediate. Some argued that allowing their young girl to accompany a lion, no matter how apparently friendly, was simply too dangerous to consider. Others pointed out that the animal had already demonstrated both his intelligence and his gratitude, suggesting that Amara might be safer with him than she would be wandering the plains alone. The debate might have continued for hours if not for the intervention of Nkosazana, whose voice carried special weight due to her age and her reputation for wisdom. The old grandmother reminded everyone present that Amara had been born with gifts that went beyond the ordinary, abilities that had led her to the trapped lion in the first place and enabled her to communicate with him in ways that defied normal understanding. She argued that some opportunities come only once in a lifetime, and that turning away from such a chance might be a greater danger than accepting it. Her words carried the authority of someone who had seen enough of life to recognize when the extraordinary was presenting itself. After much deliberation and several conditions regarding safety and time limits, the village council agreed to allow Amara to accompany the lion, provided that she was back before sunset and that her father went with her to ensure her protection. Django, who had been quietly supportive of his daughter's unusual connection with the great cat, readily agreed to the arrangement. He had seen too much during their first encounter to doubt that something truly special was happening, something that might never occur again if they failed to embrace it. As the afternoon sun climbed toward its peak, Amara and Django prepared for their second journey with the magnificent lion who had already changed their lives in ways they were still learning to understand. The great cat waited patiently while they gathered water and basic supplies, his amber eyes bright with anticipation for whatever revelation awaited them in the wilderness beyond their village boundaries. The entire community gathered to watch their departure, men and women and children all understanding that they were witnessing something that would become part of their tribal history. As the unlikely trio set off across the plains, with a golden lion leading the way and the human father and daughter following close behind, the villagers felt they were watching the beginning of a legend that would be told and retold for countless generations to come. The great lion led Amara and her father across the African plains with the confidence of someone who knew every stone and grass blade in his territory. Their journey took them through landscapes that seemed to change with each mile they traveled, from the familiar grasslands near their village to rolling hills dotted with ancient acacia trees, and finally toward a region where massive rock formations created natural amphitheaters that echoed with the sounds of their footsteps. As they walked, Amara noticed details about their guide that she had missed during their nighttime rescue encounter. His gait was perfectly balanced despite having been trapped for hours just over a week ago, showing no sign of lasting injury from his ordeal. More remarkably, there was something about his presence that seemed to affect the entire landscape around them. Birds that would normally flee at the approach of a lion instead perched nearby, calling out what sounded almost like greetings. Zebras and antelope that should have scattered in panic instead watched their passage with calm interest, as if recognizing that this particular predator posed no threat while he traveled with his human companions. The morning progressed into afternoon as they climbed steadily higher, following game trails that wound between boulders and through narrow passes that seemed designed by nature to hide secrets from casual observers. Django, with his scout's trained eye for terrain, realized they were being led toward a part of the eastern hills that even he had never explored, a region that had always seemed somehow forbidden or protected by forces beyond normal understanding. It was as the sun reached its afternoon peak that they finally arrived at their destination, and the sight that greeted them was so extraordinary that both humans stopped in their tracks, unable to process what they were seeing. Before them lay a hidden valley, invisible from the surrounding plains, with a most magnificent gathering of lions either of them had ever imagined stretched across a landscape that seemed to have been created specifically for their comfort and safety. There were lions everywhere, dozens of them, representing every age and size, from tiny cubs that tumbled and played in the golden grass to ancient patriarchs whose massive forms spoke of decades of successful survival in the African wilderness. But these were not ordinary lions. Like their guide, each animal possessed an unusual magnificence, coats that seemed to shimmer with inner light, manes that were fuller and more golden than nature typically produced, and bearing that suggested intelligence and awareness far beyond what most humans attributed to wild animals. In the center of the gathering, resting in the shade of a massive baobab tree whose trunk was so wide that 20 people holding hands could not have encircled it, lay the most extraordinary lioness Amara had ever seen. Her coat was the color of burnished gold, and her eyes held depths that seemed to contain wisdom accumulated over lifetimes. When she rose to acknowledge their arrival, every other lion in the valley turned to watch, their attention indicating clearly that this female held a position of absolute authority among them. But the most amazing discovery was yet to come. Nestled close to the great lioness, protected by her warmth and obviously nursing from her, were 4 cubs unlike any that had ever been born in the African wilderness. Their coats were not the typical tawny brown of normal lion cubs, but rather a rich golden color that seemed to capture and reflect sunlight even in the shade. Their eyes, already open despite their obvious youth, sparkled with the same unusual intelligence that marked all the adults in this hidden sanctuary. The lion who had guided them to this secret place moved forward to join his pride, and as he approached the magnificent lioness and her extraordinary cubs, the entire scene suddenly made perfect sense to Amara. This was a family reunion, a father introducing his mate and newborn offspring to the humans who had saved his life and made this moment possible. The cubs that nursed so contentedly in the afternoon warmth existed because their father had survived his encounter with a boulder, lived to return to his pride, and been present when they were born. What they were witnessing was not just a gathering of lions, but the existence of a bloodline that carried within it something far beyond the ordinary. These animals possessed qualities that bridged the gap between the physical and spiritual worlds, creatures whose very presence seemed to transform the space around them into something sacred and protected. The Hidden Valley was not just their home. It was a sanctuary where the most essential qualities of the lion spirit had been preserved and concentrated. The great lioness approached Amara with the same deliberate grace that had marked her mate's movements, and when they stood face to face, human girl and lion queen, something passed between them that was both recognition and blessing. The lioness seemed to understand that Amara's courage had preserved not just the life of her mate, but the future of her cubs and the continuation of their extraordinary lineage. In her amber gaze was gratitude that went beyond individual appreciation to encompass the deep gratitude of a species for an act of interspecies compassion. What happened next was something that neither Amara nor her father could have anticipated. The lioness picked up one of her cubs, the smallest and most golden of the 4, and carried it toward them with careful steps. When she reached Amara, she gently placed the cub at the girl's feet and stepped back, her actions clearly communicating that this was a gift, a living symbol of the bond that had been forged between human and lion through courage and kindness. The cub, rather than being frightened by its first close contact with humans, immediately began to purr and rub against Amara's legs with the confident affection of a domesticated cat. Its tiny form radiated the same warmth and intelligence that marked all the members of its pride, but There was something additional about this particular cub, a quality that suggested it had been chosen for reasons that went beyond simple genetics or family loyalty. As Amara knelt down to interact with the remarkable gift she had been given, she began to understand that this cub was not meant to be taken away from its family and pride, but rather to serve as a living connection between the human and lion worlds. The young animal would grow up knowing both species, carrying within itself the memory of the kindness that had brought these two very different families together, and perhaps serving as a bridge for future encounters between its kind and Amara's people. The afternoon passed in wonder as the humans were welcomed into the heart of the pride's daily life. They watched cubs play games that seemed to incorporate elements of hunting practice and pure joy, observed the complex social interactions between adults that demonstrated cooperation and affection that many humans would have envied, and gradually came to understand that they were being shown something that had never before been revealed to their species. This hidden pride represented the best of what lions could be when protected from the constant pressures of survival that dominated life on the open plains. Here, in their secret sanctuary, they had developed not just physically, but intellectually and emotionally, becoming creatures that embodied the very essence of nobility and wisdom that human cultures had always associated with the king of beasts. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, signaling that their time in the hidden valley was drawing to a close, the great male lion who had guided them there approached Amara one final time. In his amber eyes was a message that she understood without need for words or gestures. He was telling her that this secret would always be safe with her, that the location of the hidden pride would never be revealed to those who might bring harm to its inhabitants, and that the bond between them would endure for as long as either of their bloodline survived. The journey back to the village was made in contemplative silence, each of the three travelers lost in their own thoughts about what they had experienced. The small golden cub rode comfortably in Amara's arms, already settling into the role that fate had chosen for it as a living symbol of the extraordinary friendship that had developed between two very different species. When they finally reached the boundaries of the Kasai village, the sun had already set, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the African sky. The entire community was waiting for their return, eager to learn what wonders the lion had wanted to share with them. But as Amara looked down at the sleeping cub in her arms and thought about the magnificent secret hidden in the eastern hills, she knew that some stories were too precious and too dangerous to be told in their entirety. What she would share with her people was the miracle of the bond that had been forged, the proof that courage and compassion could bridge any gap between species, and the living symbol of hope that now purred contentedly in her arms. But the location of the hidden pride, the existence of the sanctuary where lions had evolved beyond their normal limitations, and the true extent of the intelligence and nobility she had witnessed, these secrets she would guard with her life. Standing at the edge of her village, with the golden cub nestled against her chest, and the memory of amber eyes filled with gratitude glowing in her mind, Amara understood that she had become part of something larger than herself, a story that would continue long after she had returned to the earth that had given her life. She was now the keeper of a legend, the guardian of a secret, and the first human to truly understand what lions might become when treated with the respect and kindness they deserved. The great lion watched from the darkness beyond the village boundaries as his human friends rejoined their community, his amber eyes reflecting the starlight like golden flames. Soon he too would return to his hidden valley, to his magnificent mate and his extraordinary cubs, carrying with him the memory of the girl whose courage had made it all possible. And in that hidden sanctuary, protected by secrets and sustained by the bond between species, the most magnificent bloodline of lions in the history of Africa would continue to flourish, growing stronger and more remarkable with each passing generation. 20 years had passed since that magical afternoon when Amara first held the golden cub in her arms, and the world had changed in ways that no one in the Kasai village could have imagined. The small cub had grown into a magnificent lion whose intelligence and loyalty had become legendary throughout the region, while Amara herself had matured into a woman whose wisdom and courage were sought by tribes from across the vast African continent. The lion, whom she had named Django after her father in honor of the man who had helped make their first meeting possible, had never truly been tamed in the way that domestic animals are controlled and trained. Instead, he had chosen to remain close to the human settlement, creating a partnership based on mutual respect and affection that defied every traditional understanding of the relationship between predator and prey. During the day, Django often roamed the plains around the village, hunting when necessary, but more frequently serving as a guardian whose mere presence kept other predators at a safe distance from the Kasai settlement. Children who had grown up seeing him daily played nearby while he rested in the shade, their parents no longer afraid because 20 years of experience had proven that this particular lion understood the difference between friend and potential threat with an accuracy that surpassed that of most humans. In the evenings, Django would return to the village to spend time with Amara, who had built a special shelter on the outskirts of the settlement where they could be together without disturbing the daily activities of the community. These twilight hours became a time of communication and bonding that continued to amaze everyone who witnessed it, as woman and lion shared a form of conversation that went far beyond what most people believe possible between different species. But their relationship was more than just an extraordinary friendship. Django had become Amara's partner in a mission that had grown from their initial encounter into something that would reshape the way humans and animals interacted throughout the region. Using her unique ability to communicate with wildlife and Django's status as a respected predator, Amara had begun mediating conflicts between human settlements and the wild animals whose territories increasingly overlapped with expanding tribal boundaries. When farmers complained of elephants damaging their crops, Amara and Django would investigate and often discover that the animals were simply following traditional migration routes that had become blocked by new human activities. Rather than resorting to violence, she would find ways to redirect the elephant herds or help the farmers modify their practices to accommodate the ancient patterns of animal movement. When reports came in of lions attacking livestock, Amara would often discover that the predators were young males who had been driven from their prides and were struggling to survive on their own. With Django's help in establishing communication, she could frequently arrange for these displaced animals to be accepted into other prides or guided toward territories where they could hunt without coming into conflict with human interests. Her reputation as someone who could solve problems that others saw as impossible grew throughout the region, and delegations began arriving at the Kasai village from tribes that lived hundreds of miles away, all seeking the wisdom of the woman who had befriended a lion and learned to speak the languages that all species shared. These visitors brought stories of their own encounters with wildlife, tales of conflict and cooperation that helped Amara understand that the bond she shared with Django was part of a much larger pattern of connection between humans and animals. It was during one of these visits, as representatives from 7 different tribes gathered to discuss a crisis involving a drought that was forcing both human and animal populations to compete for the same limited water sources, that Django exhibited behavior that reminded everyone present of his extraordinary origins. Rather than simply listening to the human discussions, he began to actively participate, using a combination of movements, sounds, and expressions to communicate his own understanding of the situation and suggest solutions that none of the human participants had considered. The sight of a lion effectively participating in a diplomatic conference became one of the most frequently told stories in the oral traditions of all the tribes represented. But it was also a turning point in Amara's understanding of her own destiny. She realized that what had begun as an act of compassion toward a single trapped animal had evolved into something far more significant, a demonstration that the barriers between species were not as absolute as most humans believed, and that cooperation between different forms of life could achieve things that neither could accomplish alone. As word of these extraordinary negotiations spread throughout Africa, Amara began to understand that her story was becoming something larger than personal experience. It was transforming into myth and legend, growing with each telling until the facts became symbols, and the symbols became inspiration for countless other acts of courage and compassion between humans and animals. But the most remarkable chapter in their ongoing story was yet to be written. On a morning when the dry season was at its harshest and water sources throughout the region had diminished to critical levels, Django approached Amara with an urgency that reminded her of their very first encounter 20 years earlier. His behavior indicated that he wanted her to accompany him somewhere, and the intensity of his communication suggested that whatever he wanted to show her was of vital importance. Their journey that day took them farther into the wilderness than they had traveled together in many years, through landscapes that had been transformed by the ongoing drought into scenes of desperate scarcity. Dead vegetation crunched beneath their feet, and the few animals they encountered were clearly struggling to survive in conditions that tested the limits of their endurance. But Django led her with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going and what they would find when they arrived. As they walked, Amara began to realize that they were retracing the route they had taken 2 decades earlier when it first led her and her father to the hidden valley where his magnificent pride lived in their secret sanctuary. When they finally reached the concealed entrance to the valley, what they discovered was something that took Amara's breath away. Despite the devastating drought that was affecting the entire region, the hidden sanctuary remained as lush and green as it had been during their first visit. Springs that had never been seen by human eyes continued to flow with clear, abundant water, while vegetation that had withered everywhere else flourished in the protected environment of the lion's secret home. The pride had grown during the 20 years since Amara's first visit, with many of the cubs she had seen now mature adults with offspring of their own. But all of them retained the extraordinary qualities that had marked their bloodline as something special, and all of them recognized her immediately despite the passage of 2 decades since their last meeting. Standing in that oasis of abundance, surrounded by a landscape of scarcity, Amara finally understood the full significance of what Django was showing her. The hidden valley was not just a sanctuary for his pride. It was a reservoir of life itself, a place where water and vegetation had been preserved against exactly the kind of crisis that was now threatening every living thing in the region. Through his complex communication, Django made it clear that his pride was prepared to share this precious resource with the humans and other animals who were suffering from the drought, but only under conditions that would ensure the sanctuary's protection and continued abundance. It was an offer of salvation that came with responsibilities, a gift that required the recipients to become guardians rather than simply consumers. The negotiations that followed were unlike anything in the recorded history of human-animal cooperation. Representatives from dozens of tribes gathered in the Hidden Valley to work out agreements that would allow controlled access to the water and resources that meant the difference between life and death for their communities. But these were not negotiations between conquerors and the conquered. They were discussions between equals, mediated by Amara and Jingo, working together to ensure that every species' needs were considered and protected. The drought lasted for 2 more years, but during that entire period, the Hidden Valley served as a lifeline that prevented the catastrophic loss of life that would otherwise have devastated the region. Humans and animals learned to share the precious resources according to agreements that were honored by all parties because they had been created with input from every species involved. When the rains finally returned and the crisis passed, the relationships that had been forged during those difficult years did not dissolve. Instead, they became the foundation for a new way of living that recognized the interconnection between all forms of life and the benefits that could be achieved through cooperation rather than competition. Amara's role as mediator between human and animal communities became a permanent position that was eventually passed down to others who showed the same gifts for interspecies communication that had marked her own childhood. The Hidden Valley remained a sanctuary, but it also became a symbol of what could be achieved when courage and compassion guided the relationships between different forms of life. As Amara aged and eventually passed away, surrounded by her human family and Jingo's magnificent presence, her story began its transformation from personal history into eternal legend. The tale was told and retold around countless fires in dozens of languages across thousands of miles of African territory. With each telling, details were added or changed, but the essential message remained constant. Courage and kindness could bridge any gap, and cooperation between species was not only possible, but essential for the survival and prosperity of all. Django lived far longer than any normal lion, his extraordinary heritage apparently extending even to his lifespan, and he continued to serve as a guardian and symbol long after Amara herself had become memory. When he finally died, his passing was mourned by humans and animals alike, and his body was buried in the Hidden Valley beside the great baobab tree where his parents had raised their extraordinary cubs decades earlier. But death did not end the legend. Stories of Amara and Django spread beyond Africa, carried by traders and travelers who brought the tale to distant continents where it inspired new understanding of the relationships possible between humans and the animals who shared their world. The story evolved and adapted to different cultures and languages, but everywhere it was told, the message remained the same. Courage and compassion could transform enemies into allies and create bonds that would endure across generations. In time, the specific details of Amara's life and Django's magnificence faded into the realm of myth, but the inspiration they provided continued to influence how humans thought about their relationships with the natural world. Conservation efforts that saved endangered species, wildlife protection programs that preserved entire ecosystems, and countless individual acts of kindness toward animals all trace their inspiration back to the story of a young girl who chose courage over fear and a lion who chose trust over instinct. Millions of years later, when humans had spread across the entire planet and developed technologies that would have seemed like magic to Amara's people, the legend still lived on. Children in classrooms around the world learned about the importance of treating animals with respect and kindness, and many of their teachers told them the ancient story of the girl who saved a lion, and in doing so created a bond that became legendary. The Hidden Valley still existed, though its location had become one of the most carefully guarded secrets in all of Africa. Protected by international agreements and watched over by descendants of the original Kasai tribe, it remained a sanctuary where lions descended from Django's magnificent bloodline continued to thrive, their extraordinary intelligence and nobility unchanged by the passage of millennia. And sometimes, when the conditions were exactly right and the need was great enough, visitors to that sacred place reported encounters with lions whose amber eyes held depths of intelligence and compassion that seemed to bridge the gap between the physical and spiritual worlds. These modern witnesses often left the valley changed by their experience, carrying with them a renewed understanding of the connections that bound all living things together and the miracles that became possible when different species chose cooperation over conflict. Thus the legend lived on, not just as a story told around fires or written in books, but as a living truth that continued to inspire new acts of courage and compassion with each passing generation. Amara's moment of bravery beside a trapped lion had created ripples that spread across time itself, proving that a single act of kindness could indeed become legendary, and that some bonds, once forged, would never be broken.